Hello, and thank you for checking out this message from Ridgepoint. If you've attended any of our services recently or listened to any of our recent messages, you know that this is a really important and really exciting chapter in the life of our church family. There are quite a few big external changes happening right now that have been years in the making. Our huge building expansion project, our first church plant earlier this year, and even changing our name a few years before that. Beyond those big changes on the outside, we've also been doing the hard work of renewing our vision and our focus as a church. And through all of these changes, God has continued to be really faithful and shown us much favor. Right now, we're in the middle of a new teaching series called Much Expected. With all that God has done for us, now it's our turn. What does He expect in return? Today, you'll hear week 2 of this series all about the importance of taking big risks. Pastor Joe is speaking today, so let's get to that message right now.
So on most Sunday mornings, the kids and I, when we drive to church, we have to make an interesting traffic decision. We live on the east side, and so we come to the northwest side. We take 96, and many of you know this, that when you get off the exit on Sunday morning on Ridge 96, sometimes you could be at that stoplight for a really long time, and there's no cars in sight. And so we have to figure out what we're going to do. I would love to turn left on that red light, but there's so many cameras around that I'm kind of nervous to do so. So instead, I try to, like a madman, reverse up and down that ramp, thinking that maybe that's going to help the light move along. Well, Easter Sunday morning this year was no different. It happened to us again, but this time there were many other cars on the ramp too, leading us to think that perhaps we're going to catch a break, but so many cars piled up because their light stayed red. It's to the point where the person next to me, who was also in the front of the line, raised their hands in exasperation, convincing me, let's all run the red light together. I need to tell you, on Easter Sunday morning, I ran a red light on the way to church. But it made me think, it's a marvel about what we'll risk when someone is risking along with you, right? Take, for instance, also the story of Wayne Williams. Seen here, he's a big Cubs fan. His dad was too. And long ago, they made a pact that if the Cubs ever got back to the World Series, that they would watch it together. Well, unfortunately, Wayne's dad died in 1980 before they got back to the World Series. And so they were never able to kind of fulfill that promise to one another. But the Cubs did go to the World Series in the fall of 2016 against Cleveland. And so Wayne made an interesting choice. He decided to drive hours from his home in North Carolina to Indiana, where his dad was buried. And he actually watched listened to Game 7 at his father's graveside. And when they won that miraculous Game 7 in 2016, and they won the World Series, they fulfilled their promises to one another. Now, objectively speaking, Wayne's dad was no longer there. So on this face of it, this commitment being fulfilled is kind of absurd under those terms because his dad wasn't there. But since we're compassionate beings with a heart for Wayne's story, we allow that to slide. We give him license to fulfill that promise that way. I think this is a critical part of how we get along with one another in life. We provide people with the space needed to live in something called acceptable absurdity. Now, today we continue a sermon series called Much Expected, where we outline a few critical responses to God's blessing to us personally and to Ridgepoint corporately. Last week, Pastor Brent started this series by making it a demonstrative statement. He says, God has given us reasonable expectations in return to all that He's given to us personally and to us as a church corporately. And so we've gathered some values together that help us to live into that response of this expectation that we have from God. And last week, Pastor Brent briefly shared about the value of prayer to begin our conversation. So today I want to start, and I'd continue on this conversation to add another value to that equation of our response, and that is the value of risk. So for this morning's sake, I'm going to define risk as acceptable absurdity. Then I'll share one of Jesus' parables about risk, and then hopefully as we glean from the text, it'll empower us for the next risk that we seek to take in the days ahead. As always, if you have a question as the sermon goes along, there's a QR code on the screens. You can send me an email, and if there's some time at the very end of service, there should be a few minutes, I'll answer a couple of those, and we'll just continue our conversation there. But let me start off by saying this. A significant part of life is curating the scripts that we've been given to navigate life, okay? So over time, we're handed teachings and words of wisdom that help us to survive life, but also to thrive in life. And I think as we evaluate these scripts and these codes that people give to us, we can put them in two categories. Ones that we're going to need for the duration of our life, and then some that we're only going to need for a short season of time. There's probably appropriate moments for us to renegotiate some of those scripts. Take, for instance, some trivial examples. How about this one? Some parents tell their young children that they should never, under any condition, touch the stove, right? The kid gets to a certain age where they can't watch and manage the toddler as easily as they could before, so they say a carte blanche command, never touch the stove so you don't get hurt. But imagine if a kid holds on to that admonition their whole life. If they were to do so, they would never experience the joy of cooking a meal. Or maybe take, for instance, some parents who have heard the harmful effects of too much screen time for their young children, so they vow to limit to like 20 to 30 minutes a day. But imagine that same family who made that vow. They're out to dinner with some of their friends, and the 20 to 30 minutes has already been spent, and their kid is kind of getting a little fidgety at the dinner table, and they don't want to ruin dinner with their friends, so they make an eye contact with one another, they slide their phone out of their pocket, and they put on Paw Patrol or whatever they're watching these days. It's been a long time since I've been in that time of life. In order for the child to kind of calm down so they can enjoy 20 minutes of uninterrupted adult conversation that they've been craving for some time now. Or think of the person who vows not to read articles from a certain newspaper, okay, because they've been told that this newspaper has an agenda, and that agenda is harmful for American life. So they say, under no circumstances will I read from this newspaper. But then they kind of on accident begin to read a couple, and they find that it's not so bad. And so you actually begin to integrate some of those articles from that newspaper into their other offerings that they read in order to keep a more balanced opinion about what's going on in American life. Or think of that friend that you have at work and you're watching a TV show at home and you think, I think this person would love this TV show. But in the past, they've told me that they don't like to watch shows or movies with foul language. Like there's like a limit, and then after that limit, there's just no dice. But you think to yourself, man, if they could just tolerate it, maybe give this an exception to the rule. I know that they would love the theme and the moral of the story here. And so you kind of with trepidation approach them in the break room one day. You're like, hey, I know that you've said in the past this, but there's a show I think you're really going to love because of some of the other things that we've talked about before. Let me just give you a disclaimer. Like the language is bad, so I understand if you don't want to watch it. And so in that moment, they don't seem very interested. And you're like, I guess I should have expected that. But then they come to you a couple of months later and they check over their right shoulder and their left shoulder. They like close the door, turn on some white noise, and they say, hey, that TV show, I'm so surprised. I actually really enjoy it. The language is bad, but I'm getting through it. Like I'm actually really enjoying it. Please don't tell anybody, especially people who are in Bible study at church, because I don't know if I can live to tell of it, right? So we've got these scripts, and sometimes they're useful, and sometimes they're for a long time, and sometimes they're just good for a season. Now, the breaking away from these scripts, we can call these amendments acceptable transgressions, or just seasons where we test whether we need these scripts any longer or not. Now, sometimes during these seasons, we retain, yes, I continue to need this code of conduct for another season of my life. At other times, we're like, you know what? This served me faithfully before, but I think that I can leave it behind or bring some amendments to it in order to continue to navigate life. Here's the deal. Keeping the script is easy, right? Because it's familiar. But life gets kind of scary, a little risky, when we leave a certain script behind. Scripts are hard to let go of because they go against the grain of our established identities. I used to be this person. If I let this script go, can I continue to survive if I'm no longer known as this type of person? And since so much of what we think, believe, and do is associated with our communities, we fear that changing what we think, believe, or do might cause our community and support to leave us vulnerable and alone. But I contend that this negotiation of scripts is underneath the surface of the most famous parable that Jesus ever taught. Of course, I'm talking about the parable of the prodigal son that we find in Luke 15. And I think that we all know the basics of this story. It's a man with two sons, and the younger son makes an unusual request. And the father is put in a situation where he has to take a considerable risk if he wants to grant the request. In Luke 15, 12 through 13, we get to the problem of the story. This is what it says. The younger son said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the inheritance." Then the father divided his estate between them. Soon afterward, the younger son gathered everything together and took a trip to a land far away. There he wasted his wealth through extravagant living. Let's be honest, as we know the cultural background of this story, this request from the younger son was deeply offensive. So we're so surprised that instead of the father denying the request, he actually embraces the request. We got to remember that families lived close to one another in Jesus' day, and so news about this request and the granting of this request couldn't be kept secret for very long. And so there's another thing happening here subtly in the background, that this father's not only changing precedent for his own family, but there's a sense he could be like nudging his whole community into a place of upheaval, because the next thing you know, when other people hear about it, other young men might start going to their fathers and asking for this unusual request, upending many generations of tradition. So not only was the son's request a potential transgression, but perhaps the father's granting of the request is a transgression as well. This is a reality that other people have grappled with. Pastor Tim Keller wrote a famous book called The Prodigal God. He says actually the better title for this story is not the parable of the prodigal son, but the parable of the prodigal father, because the father spends so recklessly through the beginning and to the end of the narrative. So here's the questions on the table of this story, this unusual story. Was this risk that the father took in this story worth it? Was the transgression acceptable one or not? And then finally, how do we know which is true? First, let's just talk about the son's absurd request. Did it sever the relationship with the father that we expected that it would do? Actually, as we continue to read the story, we read with great joy that the father had when he saw his son again. If you read in the parable, you see that when his son's still far off, the father runs to him in order to embrace him. Actually, one of the most vivid ideas that comes to the surface of the story is the discrepancy for what the younger son was seeking when he returned home versus what the father gave him in return. We can see the son's expectation in verses 18 and 19. He's actually rehearsing a speech that he wants to give to his father. You can imagine him mile after mile rehearsing this under his breath in order to perfect his plea. This is what he says: "Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I no longer deserve to be called your son. Take me to become one of your hired hands." So the son knows that he's probably going to be disowned by his family. Maybe he can get a part-time job with his father's estate. But when it came time for the son to face his father, and as he launches into his plea, his sales pitch, the father actually stops him. He doesn't allow him to complete his plea. This is what happens next in verses 22 through 24. But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Fetch the fattened calf and slaughter it. We must celebrate with feasting, because this son of mine was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and he is found." And they began to celebrate. The younger son came home looking for a job, but instead he received a family. The transgression didn't annihilate their relationship. It deepened their relationship. So perhaps the distance from one another revealed this great love that they actually had for one another that they weren't even aware of. But the situation brought it to the surface. What's lovely about this story, why we tell it again and again, is that love, not the offense, gets the last word in this relationship. The Father and the Son developed an even deeper relationship than before because of this transgression. But another question lingers on the surface that we need to address. Did this risk from the Father harm the wider community? Because that was certainly at stake. To answer this, we should be reminded of the occasion of the parable. Jesus doesn't just tell this story because it's a nice story, but it's actually in response to an accusation that's given to him. It's actually at the end of 3 consecutive parables with similar themes. So we have to go all the way back to Luke 15:1 and 2 to get the context of why Jesus told the story to begin with. There we read that all the tax collectors and the sinners were gathering around Jesus to listen to him. The Pharisees and legal experts were grumbling, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Now, this is no small deal in Jesus' culture. Many Jews in Jesus' time did not associate with people who they deemed outside of the boundary of faithfulness. Some in Jesus' day even assumed that their current struggles as a nation was the direct result of how previous generations compromised with foreign nations, that God was judging them because of the conduct of previous generations. So when they give this accusation to Jesus, it's not just, Jesus, we're kind of questioning who your friends are on Facebook. Like, it's not that at all. They're saying, Jesus, if you're not careful, you're going to cause God's judgment to come upon our community. So perhaps Jesus' parable sought to address this head on. Once again, not just telling some wonderful story, but in a way he's trying to reach out to his opponents who had an offense against him. This parable was employed to challenge those popular assumptions that came from his opponents. Just as no one ever expected the father to decide what he did by giving the inheritance and welcoming his son back after a long season of rebellion, so in the same way, many did not think that religious life among tax collectors and sinners would be profitable. Jesus is doing something novel and dangerous in their minds here. So Jesus' parable is a not so fast type message. This is what Jesus is saying through the parable to his opponents. You never know what God can do outside of your expectations. And you'll never know unless you take a risk. Just like the father who allowed his son to leave and to be received back when he came home. The small detail about the fattened calf is also essential. Food was not plentiful in Jesus' day, and even for someone who's affluent, like the father character in this story, they didn't have a lot of fattened calves kind of running around. They didn't have like a deep freeze full of food for them just to be able to, on a moment's notice, prepare for a large crowd. Whenever you took the fattened calf, it was like you were making a point to have a party, like a once-in-a-year type of party where there would be many guests. In fact, whenever they began to cook the fattened calf, it was kind of like this RSVP to the whole community. Y'all come over and make sure you bring a side dish with you. So all would have seen who attended that party, and it looks like there was a lot of people there. Everybody would have seen the son return home, even those who had some objection to the father's choice of honoring this odd request. Other parents in that community would have shared in the father's joy. They could sympathize with the fact that this son was lost for a long time, but he came back home. And so the joy that the father had, they could resonate with it because they themselves were parents. So they could imagine the pain of having a son far away from home. So perhaps the celebration has a great effect. It would have convinced other families, perhaps, to rethink their own scripts about what it means to be parents, what it means to have a family, and what it means and how you create a bond with people in your family. What was unfolding before their eyes, the son that left and he came back and received back into his family, it was absurd and it was nearly impossible. And it would have challenged their scripts and their assumptions. But new possibilities could be imagined because of the risk of this father several months before. There's now new things to consider because of the new things that are happening before their eyes. Unfortunately, Not everyone agreed of the great potential of what was happening at the party. Many of us know that at the very end of this parable, there's another son who enters into the story late. And he's the meticulously obedient older son who takes objection to what his father has been doing. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this whole story is how limited the older son felt like his life was inside that household. We hear it in his exasperation in Luke 15:29. It says, "Look, I've served you all these years. I've never disobeyed your instruction. You've never given me as much as a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends." We obviously know that this father is not stingy. He's just given a third of his wealth to a wayward younger son months before. So he wasn't stingy, but that was the perspective that the younger son had. And so you can imagine the heartbreak that the father felt when he said these words in verse 31, "Son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." The older son had it all. He just never asked, and he never had the guts to take a risk. Now the story ended there. It's like the curtain falls almost prematurely at the end of the story because we have so many more questions. One on the surface is, well, what did the older son do? Did he join the party? Or did he continue to mutter in his self-righteousness and judgment towards his younger brother? But what is clear is that Jesus gave the Pharisees and the teachers of the law a lot to think about, because he actually draws a straight line to their critical behavior with the older son in the story. So through this parable, Jesus is gently asking his opponents to consider taking risks with him and doing religion among the tax collectors and sinners. Like the father who rolled the dice and created a bond with the wayward son. Come take a risk with me. Unfortunately, as the gospel story continues to roll out, we know that his opponents never believed with Jesus about the potential of religious life among tax collectors and sinners. And when Jesus' movement became unavoidable, they had Jesus arrested and crucified. But when God the Father raised Jesus from the dead, it represented more than just a neat miracle, an unusual thing that happened on display before everybody. What theologians have told us from the church fathers up to this present day, the resurrection is more than just a miracle. It's also a sign of vindication from God the Father, that Jesus was right, his words were right, his way is right, and we're going to continue to do the things that Jesus is going to do, all those who call upon the name of the Lord, including we're going to wander past the boundaries of what we consider safe, past the boundaries of comfort, in order to engage with people way outside of our comfort zone. And we see that the early church took Jesus' word for it. We see this in the narrative of the book of Acts. The book of Acts begins with a band full of Jesus' disciples, just uneducated sectarian Jews, peppering Jesus with questions about when is God going to restore the fortunes to Israel? A bunch of insider baseball talk. When are you going to take care of our country's needs? In response to that inquiry, Jesus says these words to them. It's one of his parting words before he returns to the presence of the Father. He says, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." And so they scatter, beginning to preach this good news. And the book of Acts ends with this Pharisee named Paul under house arrest, preaching Christ crucified right under the nose of Caesar in the capital city of Rome. This narrative of this story has taken an interesting turn that nobody was expecting. And between these two realities, this insider baseball talk to preaching in Rome, there's all these wonderful stories of the church turning loose, having wild tales and adventures of faith because they trusted in the God who was wandering outside the boundary lines. They did this because they decided to take risks. And they allowed fellow believers to engage in bold acts of acceptable absurdity. And the church was changed because of it. Here's the deal. Over the last 80 years, Ridgepoint Church, you've engaged in many acts of acceptable absurdity. In fact, if you've been here long enough, you know that we've made several changes at a breathtaking pace here in the last few years. And because you've been able to navigate those, that's been a wonderful story to tell. But I have some news for us this morning. The future is going to require that we take more acts of acceptable absurdity. We haven't filled the punch card yet. We got some more risky decisions to make. Perhaps the most glaring one in front of us is deciding how to be Christians amid the grim future that's been forecasted for religion in post-Christian America. What we see is that fewer and fewer people are engaging in Christian community, while more and more people distrust institutions that used to loom large in our society. A predictable response with those two dynamics, what we see more common than not, is for some Christians to retreat into smaller and smaller communities of like-mindedness, of circling the wagons, because that is the most safest and most comfortable place to be. But if that's our penchant, if that's our response to our dilemma in front of us, let me ask us a question, maybe the one that the Holy Spirit's asking for us to grapple with today. Does that way of life correlate with our unfolding story that's been going on since the beginning? Or should we trust God and make some risky decisions in the days ahead? I know it's going to sound funny, but I think that God is leading us as individuals and us together as a church to take some turns at red lights, to set up camp next to Dad's grave, to kill the fattened calf, and to live with some acceptable absurdity. The question that you and I need to grapple with this morning is that are we going to follow God into that future that's going to be full of risk? Let's pray together this morning. God, we thank you that you're a generous and just God. We thank you that you risked by lowering yourself and giving up your heavenly privileges in order to be a sacrificial lamb on a cross and to win the world to yourself. God, this day we see the pattern of what it means to be in Christ, which is to take risks and to be people of faith into the unknown. And so God, this day we confess to you at times we're so used to our comfort, we're so used to the predictability that we're reluctant to take those risky choices. So God, this day, I pray that you'd fill us with your Spirit once more. Help us to reclaim and to trust our story. Wander outside the boundaries of our comfort in order to see what you're doing in the far beyond. God, we thank you for Ridgepoint Church, that we've proven to be a risky church. Those who are bold and daring, willing to take leaps into the unknown. May you find us faithful to take another leap in the days ahead. We ask all these things in Jesus' name, and all of God's people said, amen.
Thanks again for watching or listening with us today. Real quick before you go, we always want to make sure that you know where to go if you would like to take a next step in your faith, or if you'd like more information about our church. Of course, our website would be a great first step, so we invite you to check out ridgepointwichita.com and feel free to browse around anything that might be helpful to you. We also often give out the texting line where you can text the word Ridge to the number 97000. That will open up a dialogue between us where you can share some basic information, and then you can also respond with any questions you may have. And I promise a real-life person will be on the other end of the line, ready to get back to you. So if you have any questions, or if you haven't engaged with us before, I encourage you to do that. And one more thing, if you enjoy watching or listening to our messages, I wanted to make sure that you know that Pastor Joe and I also do another weekly show on YouTube, Facebook, and now on our podcast called Trending. Every Thursday, we take a look at one of the top trending stories of that day in news or pop culture, and Joe and I do our best to analyze it from a faith perspective. We think it's really important that we know what's going on in the world around us, but also to weave in our faith in Jesus with practical issues that we each face every day. So if that sounds like something you might be interested in, give Ridgepoint Church a follow on Facebook or YouTube, or you can also find it if you're listening to our podcast. Right now, that show shows up on our main Ridgepoint Sermon podcast feed, but soon we'll be launching out as a separate podcast, so we'll keep you posted on that. And of course, we meet every Sunday morning, so we hope you'll join us again next time as we continue our much-expected sermon series with Pastor Brent back next week. Have a great week wherever you are, and we hope to see you again real soon.